a personal look at classical education. I loved going to school at home. As a high school student, I would get up in the morning, practice the piano for 2 hours, do my mathematical and grammatical lessons, finish off my science lessons, and then devote the rest of my school day to my favorite subjects, that of history, ancient languages, and writing. Once a week, we all piled into the car and drove around to music lessons, mathematic tutoring lessons, library visits, and college classes. On weekends, we went to athletic meets, my brother's bicycle races, the horse shows my sister and I trained for, and Broden. But I was nervous when I went away to college, although I'd done well on standardized exams, although I studied mathematics and grammar, studied science as well. My favorite subjects were history, ancient languages, and that of writing. I had never really sat in a regular classroom facing inflexible deadlines. I was used to taking tests from my mother. I should not have worried. I tested out of 30 hours worth of college courses by my second semester. I was taking 400 level courses. I had a host of strange skills. I could diagram sentences. I could read Latin. I knew enough logic to tell whether an assertion was true or false. And I was surrounded by 18-year-olds who could not write, did not want to read, and could not reason. I worked in the Peer Tutoring Center for 2 years, tutoring English composition and Greek grammar. I found myself teaching 5th grade grammar to college students. My peers came in because they were getting failing grades in composition. I discovered that they could not tell the difference between fragments and run-on sentences. Students of Greek came in because they were having trouble translating. They could not identify nouns and verbs or tell me what the difference of them were. This college was small and non-exclusive, but the problem is universal. 10 years later, I taught my first semester of university classes at the College of William and Mary in Virginia. William and Mary, which still holds to the model of classical education, is selective about admissions. The students in my literature classes had high grades, high test scores, lots of extracurricular credits. I had 60 students in my first year and taught 2 sections of major British writers, 18th and 19th centuries, including John Swift to Arthur Conan Doyle, in one time. I spent the beginning of the semester teaching remedial English to these freshmen. My first hint of double trouble came when I assigned Wordsworth's Ode, Imitations of Immortality, and gave a reading quiz. I collected the test. I saw that Wordsworth's title had been thoroughly mangled. Intermissions. Didn't any of you learn phonetic spelling? I asked. Most of them shook their heads. Well, I already knew that phonics tends to be unfashionable, so I decided to be merciful. After all, I thought, they can always run a spell checker on their papers. I told them to write a 4 to 6 page paper comparing 2 of the poems that we have covered, or comparing one of the poems to a modern work. No footnotes necessary, no research into scholarly articles required. Almost at once, the email started to flood into my electronic mailbox. Professor Barr, I never wrote a paper on a poem before, and I don't know where to start. Professor Barr, I want to write on the rhyme of the Ancient Mariner, but I don't think I can say enough about it to fill up 4 pages. The Rhyme of the Ancient Mariner has enough metaphor and philosophy in it to provide material for a doctoral thesis. While thinking about my paper topic, I have realized that I have no clue as to what I should write on. Professor Barr, I am completely lost. I only have delusions of correct paper topics. The papers, when they were finally turned in, contained a few gems, but the majority were badly written, illogical, and full of grammatical errors. And with a few exceptions, my privately educated students struggled right along with their public school graduates. They labored to put a thesis into words. They sweated and complained and groaned, trying to prove it. And they did not know whether they had proved it or not when they got to the end of their paper. I spent time talking to these freshmen and sophomores in my office. They are bright, lively, energetic, interesting kids. They have ideas and passions, and philosophical problems, and social concerns, and creative aspirations. But they have been done a great disservice. Their schools have them few tools. Their minds are filled with the raw materials needed for success, but they are having to dig with their hands. I was ahead of them when I was their age, not because of superior mental abilities, but because I had been equipped with a close closet full of mental tools. My mother taught us the way she had been taught at home. Our education was language-centered, not image-centered. We read and listened and wrote, but we rarely watched. She spent the early years of school giving us facts, systematically laying the foundation for advanced study. She taught us to think through arguments, and then she taught us how to express ourselves. This is the classical pattern of the trivium, the 3-part process of training the mind. in the Universitas. The first years of schooling are called the grammar stage, not because you spend 4 years doing English, but because these are years in which the building blocks for all other learning are laid, just as grammar is the foundation for language. In the elementary school years, grades 1 through 4, the mind is ready to absorb information. Since children at this age actually find memorization fun, during this period, education involves not self-expression and self-discovery, but rather the learning of facts, rules of phonics and spelling, rules of grammar, poems, the vocabulary of foreign languages, the stories of history and literature, descriptions of plants and animals, and that of the human body, facts of mathematics. The list goes on and on. This information makes up the grammar for the second stage of education. By the 5th grade, however, a child's mind begins to think more analytically. Middle school students are less interested in finding out facts than in asking why. The second phase of the classical education, the logic stage, is a time when the child begins to pay attention to cause and effect, to the relationships among different fields of knowledge, to the ways facts fit together into a logical framework. And again, at this time, they're thinking more critically. They're developing critical thinking skills. A student is ready for the logic stage when the capacity for abstract thought begins to mature. During these years, the student learns algebra and logic and begins to apply logic to all academic subjects. The logic of writing, for example, includes paragraph construction and support for a thesis. The logic of reading involves the criticism and analysis of texts, not simple absorption of information. The logic of history demands that the student find out why the War of 1812 was fought, rather than simply reading its story. The logic of science requires the child to learn the scientific method, the hypothetical deductive method, that is. The final phase of a classical education, the rhetoric stage, builds on the first two stages. At this point, the high school student learns to write and speak with force and originality. The student of rhetoric applies the rules of logic learned in middle school to the foundational information learned in the early grades and expresses his or her conclusions in clear, forceful, elegant language. The student also begins to specialize in whatever branch of knowledge attracts him or her, and these are the years for art camps, college courses, foreign travel, apprenticeships, and other forms of specialized training. A classical education is more than just a pattern of learning, though. First, it is a language-focused education. Learning is accomplished through words, written and spoken, rather than through images, pictures, videos, and television. And even more now, we see that every classroom, students are on their computers playing, more watching rather than actually writing and doing. Why is this important? Language learning and image learning require very different habits of thought. Language requires the mind to work harder. In reading, the brain is forced to translate a symbol, words on the page, into a concept. Images, such as those on videos and television, do allow the mind to be passive. In front of a video screen, the brain can sit back and relax. Faced with the written page, the mind is required to roll its sleeves up and get to work. Second, a classical education follows a specific three-part pattern. The mind must be first supplied with facts and images, then given the logical tools for organization of those facts and images, and finally equipped to express conclusions. Third, to the classical mind, all knowledge is interrelated. Astronomy, for example, isn't studied in isolation. It is learned along with the history of scientific discovery, or the history of science in general, which leads into the church's relationship to science, and then from then on to the intricacies of medieval church history, etc. Of course, the reading of the Odyssey allows the student to consider Greek history, the nature of heroism, the development of the epic, the humankind's understanding of the divine, etc. This is easier said than done. The world is full of knowledge, and finding the links between fields of study can be a mind-twisting task. A classical education meets this challenge by taking history as its organizing outline, beginning with the ancients and progressively forward to the moderns in history, science, literature, art, and music. We suggest that the 12 years of education consist of 3 repetitions of the same 4-year pattern. The ancients from around 5000 BCE to CE 400, the medieval period through the early Renaissance, 400 to 1600, the late Renaissance through early modern times from 1600 to 1850, again about the dawn of the 17th century to the middle half of the 19th century, and then modern times from 1850 to the present time. Of course, the child studies these 4 time periods at varying levels. Very simple for grades 1 through 4, more difficult in grades 5 through 8, when the student at that time begins to read original sources, and taking an even more complex approach in grades 9 through 12, when the student works through these time periods using original sources. For example, from Homer to Hitler, and also has the opportunity to pursue a particular interest, that of music, dance, technology, medicine, biology, creative writing, in depth. The other subject areas of the curriculum are linked to history studies. The student who is working on ancient history will read Greek and Roman mythology, the tale of the Iliad and Odyssey, early medieval writings, Chinese and Japanese fairy tales, and for the older student, the classical text of Plato, Herodotus, Virgil, Aristotle, etc. They will read Beowulf, Dante, Chaucer, Shakespeare, when they are studying medieval and early Renaissance history. For example, when the 18th and 19th centuries are studied, they will start with Swift's Gulliver Travels and end with Charles Dickens. And finally, they will read modern literature as they are studying modern history. The sciences are studied in a 4-year pattern that roughly corresponds to the periods of scientific discovery in the history of science, biology, classification in the human body, subjects known to the ancients as well, earth science and basic astronomy, which flowered during the early Renaissance, chemistry, which came into its own during the early modern period, and basic physics and computer science, very modern subjects indeed. and so, as we can see, in grades 1, 5, and 9, we'll have the period of the ancients from 5000 BCE to 400 CE, and it will cover the scientific subjects of biology, classification, and the human body, so anatomy and physiology. The period of the medieval age to the early Renaissance, from around the fall of the Roman Empire in 500 BCE to the dawn of the 17th century. The grades, it will be in grades 2, 6, and 10. These subjects, scientific subjects studied will be earth science and astronomy. And the late Renaissance to early modern period from 1600 to 1850, about a 250-year period, the scientific subject will be chemistry, and that will be studied in 3rd grade, 7th grade, and 11th grade. And then the period of the modern times from 1850 to our present day, the subjects that will be studied will be physics and computer science in 4th grade, 8th grade, and 12th grade. This pattern lends coherence to the study of history, science, and literature, subjects that are too often fragmented and confusing. The pattern widens and deepens as the student matures and learns. For example, a 1st grader listens to you read the story of the Iliad from one of the picture book versions available at any public library. 4 years later, the 5th grader reads one of the popular middle grade adaptations, Olivia Coleridge's The Trojan War, or Roger L. Greene's The Tale of Troy. 4 more years go by, and the 9th grader, faced with Homer's Iliad itself, plunges right in, undaunted. They already know the story. What is to be scared of? In the chapters that follow, we will show you how to follow this pattern for each subject, list the resources that you will need, and tell you where to find these. Classical education is, above all, systematic, in direct contrast to the scattered, unorganized nature of so much secondary education. Rigorous systematic study has 2 purposes. Rigorous study develops virtue in the student. Aristotle defines virtue as the ability to act in accordance to what one knows to be right. Virtuous men or women can force themselves to do what they know is right, even when it runs against their inclinations. Classical education continually asks a student to work against his or her baser tendencies, laziness, lethargy, or the desire to watch another half hour of TV in order to reach a goal, mastery of a subject. Systematic study also allows the student to join what Mortimer J. Adler, in psychology, of course, calls the great conversation, the ongoing conversation of great minds down through the ages. Much modern education is so eclectic that the student has little opportunity to make connections between past events and the flood of current information. The beauty of the classical curriculum, writes classical schoolmaster David Hicks, is that it dwells on one problem, one author, or one epoch, long enough to allow even the youngest student a chance to exercise his or her mind in a scholarly way, to make connections and to trace developments, lines of reasoning, patterns of action, recurring symbolisms, plots, and motifs. My mother struggled hard to give us the benefits of a classical education. She began to teach us at home in the day when few materials existed at the time for home educating parents. She had to create her own curriculum. We were going to lay out a whole plan of study for you, not just theory, but resources and textbooks and curricula. It is still hard work, however, we don't deny this. We'll give you a clear view of the demands and requirements of this academic project. But a classical education is worth every drop of sweat. I can testify to that. I am constantly grateful to my mother for my education. It gave me an immeasurable head start, the independence to innovate and work on my own, confidence in my ability to compete in the job market, and the mental tools to build a satisfying career. In 15 years, I believe that my own sons will say the same to me. Next, we will talk about the grammar stage, kindergarten through 4th grade. Dorothy Sayers, from her book, The Lost Tools of Learning, says that so far, except of course for the Latin, our curriculum contains nothing that departs very far from common practice. The difference will be felt rather in the attitude of the teachers, who must look upon all these activities less as subjects in themselves than as a gathering together of material for use in the next part of the trivium.